Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. Today we have this story in Leviticus chapter 24 about this guy who gets in an argument with an Israelite, and he ends up blaspheming God's name. And because of that, he's kind of made an example of, and they take him out and stone him to death. And this is used as an opportunity for the Lord to re-emphasize the fact that no one was to blaspheme His name. And if they did, it meant the death penalty. And so the main point that we walk away with this story is that, you should not blaspheme the name of the Lord. But for our devotion today, what we want to focus on is not so much that we shouldn't blaspheme God's name. I think most of us, if not all of us in this group, know that. What's more important for us is to see what was it that caused him to blaspheme the name. Even though when you read this story, it might seem like this was just an impulsive thing. He gets mad and he just blurted out this obscenity or whatever it was that he blurted out. But as we look at more of his backstory, I think we can walk away with the fact that there were some underlining things that made him more susceptible to blaspheming the name when the opportunity presented itself. In verse 10, we're given a little bit more information about this guy. It says, "Now the son of an Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian." Alright, so this guy is partly Israelite and partly Egyptian, which means that this man most likely grew up in a mixed life. You can't hardly get more of a contrast than that of an Egyptian and an Israelite. The Israelites were monotheistic. They only believed in one God. They believed in the God of their father Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Whereas the Egyptians were polytheistic. They believed in multiple gods. Just about everything you can find on this earth represented a god or had a god attached to it. Their worldviews were different. Their means of making money were different. The Israelites were shepherds, and the Egyptians hated shepherds. And so, if you remember that story back with Joseph, that's one of the reasons why they ended up in the land of Goshen. Was because the Egyptians just did not like shepherds. And so even back when Joseph's day, there was some animosity between Egyptians and the Israelites. And this would have continued on and even increased over those 400 years in which they were in slavery. And so this guy grew up with two stark contrast cultures in his life. And we don't know if his parents were together and if he was raised in a home with his father in the Egyptian background or in Israel in the in the Israel camp. But we do know that he had parents from both backgrounds. And so when he gets into a situation where where anger rises up, when his buttons are pushed, probably that which was hidden deep within him just came out. And this wasn't just something on the spur of the moment, but there were some underlining things, probably based upon some things taught by his father from his Egyptian influence, that made him biased against the God of the Israelites, and therefore was more readily susceptible to blaspheming the name when the opportunity came. Now this guy is representative of really the whole Israelite community, because what we find with them is a mixture. Even though most of them were purely Israelites, they had a mixture in their life. They had their heart both on the journey where they were going, but also in Egypt. And that always came up whenever something was pressing, whenever they were thirsty or they were hungry, they'd always bring up Egypt. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? We had it so good in Egypt. And so you had this congregation who maybe not, as far as physically, may not have been a mixture. Mentally, they had a mixture. They had seen some great things by God, and there was times when they worshiped the Lord. There was times when they made a commitment to the Lord to observe His laws and His commandments and His testimonies and His ordinances. And then there was other times where they just wanted to go back, pack up and go back to Egypt. There was always a mixture with this group. And I think that this man presented here in Leviticus 24 is symbolic of all of Israel at that time, or at least most of Israel. But maybe even more important than that is a lesson that we can get from it as Christians. Because a lot of times we as Christians live a mixed life. We talked about before how Egypt symbolizes the world, and the whole idea of the Israelites being brought out of Egypt is kind of like God. Whenever we put our faith in Jesus Christ, He calls us out of the world. Well, this guy can be symbolic of the Christian who's a mixture of Egypt and the Israelites, or the world and the church, or the world and God's people. These would be the Christians who they pay homage to the Lord. Maybe they even go to church every Sunday. But if you were to peel back all the outward layers and you look really deep in their hearts, really their heart is just as much bound to the world as it is to the Lord. There isn't a wholehearted commitment to God. Everything that they do is kind of half-hearted. It's more to check off the list of things I have to do so that I can go to heaven or whatever. But there's really no commitment. They're not all in. They've got one foot in the world and they got one foot in heaven. And this was never what the Lord had intended for His disciples to be like. He's always desired for His disciples to be totally committed to Him. Remember, Jesus said, if you want to come after me, you got to take up your cross and follow me. That is, you got to commit everything to death. You got to walk away from your desires and your love for the world and fix your eyes on Him, to follow Him wholeheartedly. In James chapter 4, I think we have the best set of passages that talk about this mixture. These Christians who had a mixture, they were worldly Christians. And he describes what their life was like that. In verse 4 he says, "You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." And so these Christians were very worldly. Yes, they were probably attending the services. They probably knew the correct doctrine about Christ and different things, but they were still very worldly. And what happens is when you have a person with a mixture, they might carry on for a long time and you not even notice it. Think about this guy in the Israelite camp who is half Egyptian and half Israelite. Probably went a long time. He's going along with what everybody else is doing. You don't really hear about him, so he's not causing too much of a disturbance. But then as soon as a situation arises, his true heart comes out. And that's what happens typically with Christians who have a mixed life. When situations arise, when things come up, their true self comes out. Their true heart's desire comes out. They might hide it for a long time, but eventually it comes out. Well, what type of things come out of a Christian who has a mixed heart? Well, there's probably a long list of things that would come out of such a Christian, but we'll just stick with the list that James gives here in James chapter 4. In verse 1, he says that they were quarreling. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? you know, they had these pleasures, these desires. It says you lust and you do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and you cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. They were just seeking pleasure. They were seeking to fulfill their desires, to have the things of this world. And it came out in envy, jealousy, quarrels, conflicts. What was on the inside was manifested on the outside in their lives. Well, what do we do in a situation if we find ourselves with a mixture within? Well, this is what James says. First, we have to humble ourselves. In verse 6, he says, "But he gives a greater grace. Therefore it says, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee to you." You got to submit to the Lord. Submit and commit everything to God. I don't think it will work very well if you just start trying to pick out things in your life. Well, I'm going to start loving my car less, or I'm going to start loving money less. No, it's an all or nothing deal. You got to totally commit yourself to the cross. You got to consider the world crucified to yourself, as Paul did in Galatians chapter 6. You got to commit it all to the Lord, and you have to submit everything to Him. And then we got to draw near to Him. Verse 8, draw near to God and He will draw near to you. By drawing close to the Lord in prayer and devotion and worship, draw near to Him, He'll draw near to you. The more and more we love the Lord, the less and less we'll love everything else. It's just a natural way things go. You don't have to necessarily intentionally love the world less. All you got to do is love the Lord more, and consequently, you'll love the world less. But then we also need to cleanse our hands. We need to undo all of the things that perhaps we've done, the sins that we have committed, and make those right. And then he says you got to purify your hearts. And he calls them you double-minded. There's the mixture. Both a mind for heaven, wanting to go to heaven, but also a mind for the world. And he says you got to purify yourself. If you have a glass of water, it's not pure until it is just water. As long as you have a mixture in that water, it is not pure water anymore. It's a mixture. If you have tea in there, then it's tea. If you have Kool-Aid in there, then it's Kool-Aid. It's not pure water anymore. And the same thing is true with us, with our hearts. If there's a mixture within us, we don't have a pure heart. If we have a love for God, but also a love for the world, if we have a love for God, but yet we have all these desires and lusts that wage war in our bodies and against our soul, we have a mixture. We don't have a pure heart before God. Remember, Jesus said those who have a pure heart will see God. And so that's our encouragement today. Let's strive to purify our hearts, to go to the Lord and pray to Him that He will help us to dissolve any mixture that is within us, to burn away all the other things that really get in the way and distract us from being totally committed to Him. If we don't, eventually it's going to come out, and eventually we're going to do things that we're ashamed of and things that displease the Lord. So I thank you guys for watching the video once again. I hope you all have a great day. I love you guys. God bless.